Okay, I'm going to get into our next speaker. One of my first political actions was when I was probably like almost a teenager in the 1990s. A group of my friends and I liked to skateboard in Owego, and it was against the law to actually skateboard on the sidewalks or in the streets, and there were no real places to go and skateboard. So long story short, we actually formed a club with the help of a couple parents. We connected with the Cornell Cooperative Extension and the 4-H Club. We fundraised, and one way that we fundraised was they asked us, what do you guys like to do? And we said, well, we like to skateboard, obviously, and we like music. We like to go to local music shows. So we partnered with people who kind of threw local music shows, and a couple of the shows they had, they would put out like a donation can for us, or they would take a couple bucks at the door for us, which was really cool. Run was in a band that actually played one of those shows way before we knew our lives would ever sort of cross. So if anybody around here has heard of the band iFarm, that was a run, and you can look it up later if you want to be delighted to some pretty cool music. But anyways, that was my first foray into activism. Many, many years later, I was sitting at the Moose Club in Owego, New York for a debate watch party I was hosting for the newly formed Tioga County Bernie Sanders group. And my friend Doug was sitting with me at a table, and we're watching CNN, and there's everybody, and a run is on TV. And Doug points, because we'll get to why he was on TV. Doug points up at the screen and says, hey, I know that guy that's, like standing right there next to Bernie Sanders. That's my friend. I went to college with him. His name's Arun, and he does, I'm like, whoa, back up. So needless to say, he connected us, and that was how I reached out and got a run on our conference last time, was through the connection with Doug. So thank you, Doug, for bringing this all to us. Arun's history is, he was around here going to Cornell sometime in the 90s with Doug and playing in the band, and then ended up going to NYU, studying film and stuff. I think was teaching there. Forgive me if I miss some details here. There's a lot of them. Was, I believe, invited to a dinner for interesting people, I heard it referred to as, where the Obama team took an interest in Arun's talents, and he eventually went on to work for the campaign and then work for the president, who created the office of First Videographer of the United States of America for Arun to occupy. So he was the first videographer. From there, he's a partner with a company called Revolution Messaging. Again, one of these things that is involved in the behind-the-scenes stuff that builds the power that you may not recognize, but a lot of the stuff that they create, and you can look this up later, is some of the most amazing stuff that I've ever seen in the realm of political activism. So he works there, and through that work, he was what was your title with Bernie? I'm terrible. Digital Creative Director was Arun's role. So there was a bunch of cool articles about how the campaign was wise to take on a sort of punk rock sensibility in their work, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet you can Google about that. But yeah, I mean, all of the great stuff we love from Bernie's campaign, part of the reason that this movement came together and that we all have this connection with each other was Arun's work and the work of his company. So, without further ado, as a follow-up to last year's amazing presentation, I give you Arun Chaudhary.
Oh my God, that was like the nicest thing. No. I want you to follow me everywhere I go. I'm just going to plug my computer in. Hey, y'all, greetings from Texas, where your brothers and sisters in Houston, DSA, and our Revolution Gulf Coast, and our Revolution Harris County say hello. And I should put the audio thing in, right? This is going to be great. How many of y'all were in Binghamton? Okay, this is kind of like a sequel, but so if there is something where you're like, I kind of wanted to know what happened. I'm plugging in. All right. I was covering. This is very much a sequel to the Binghamton speech, and so if there is something where you're like, oh, I think I missed that episode, I'd like to know more about that, just come and find me. And that was really a lot about narrative and implementations. This is going to be a more psychedelic experience. And in that, I mean, it's going to be sort of provocative and get us all to think. And I hope, just like the last trip you all took, that you'll come back with something valuable, but you don't want to live your life by it, right? You know what I mean? So just keep that kind of perspective because we are going to go on a bit of a journey. So anything talking about modern problems in the movement, we're going to talk about 1968. We're going to talk about the old days. Because in terms of messaging, literally nothing has changed since 1968. So I want to take a look at two ads from the Nixon versus Nixon campaign of 68.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Pretty current, right? This feels pretty current. Nixon's the one. Here's the liberal retort. It's actually about Agnew, but it's the same election. So, conservatives tell us we're all going to die, and liberals laugh at them because that's stupid. This is the message on both sides. It has not changed, right? At all. So, what is to be done? What are we going to do as progressives to separate ourselves from that cycle that has literally not changed? And I'm not good at math, but I think that's like 40 years. Is that 50 years? 40 years. 50 years? 50 years. Is it the 50th anniversary of May 68? On 68? Did we all? I didn't celebrate that. All right, whatever. We are getting off track. Okay, so 1 year ago, we all met in Binghamton, and we talked about a lot of things. We talked about how broadcast was over. We talked about how we were going to start organizing in bars. We talked about how data sucks. But I don't know how this got around, I never said data people are garbage people. This was a weird thing someone said on Twitter. That I would never say that. That is insane. We talked a lot about narrative, starring Aristotle. We talked about why Barack Obama wears his mom jeans, and we talked about how Bernie Sanders is 300 years old. We confirmed that Ted Cruz was the Zodiac killer, and I stand by all of those things. And we're just going to expand on those even farther with things that I've learned this year, specifically through working for my wife, Laura Moser, who ran for Congress in the Texas 7th. Thank you. That was an applause line, and I was looking for a little something there. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. But just a quick aside, one of the things from last year that I think went a little awry, and I got called out on it by someone I think you all know real well, one of the people for Bernie, the founders, Kat Bresler. She was like, everybody fetishizes narrative now because, people like you go around saying how great it is all the time, and I don't really think that they get it. And she's right. We actually have a narrative problem in the movement right now. You can see, like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is having to explain exactly where Yorktown is and all these sort of weird details. What we need to remember, again, just to reiterate from last time, is that biography is not destiny. Your narrative isn't where you're from. It's not the details of exactly. It's how that has transformed you over time. You'll notice that when Amanda was up here talking about her narrative, she talked about how these things in the past are propelling her in the present towards a certain something. That's the narrative. Thank you very much. Just being like, I don't have a lot of cash, that's not my thing, is like not a narrative, right? It's just sort of, that's not the narrative. What we were really talking about was ways to message that fall inside of normal tactics. I think we called them the moments in between. And today we're going to talk about the tactics in between. Tactics that fall between the cracks of what we do. And we're going to get to this. Is very exciting stuff. We're going to get to it. So first, let's talk about the movement. The movement's doing pretty well. People are pretty good at it, right? We know how to make people show up places. We know how to organize them online. We know how to make them force each other to do things. Another quick aside, the distributed model of peer-to-peer texting is something that actually at RevMessage we don't endorse because we think everyone should opt into a political message and that they're mostly primed to receive it when it's, shall we say, a consensual act. But we can talk about that later. But politics should be a consensual act. We know how to engage the media. We meet people where they're at, right? That's the message. That's how we build the movement. We remember that class is a thing. We remember that race is a thing. We remember that these things go together sometimes. And this is how humans win elections. So that's the end of the lecture. But, right? And yet, this is Schrodinger's cat. He's in the box and he's not in the box. All of these things that we know work, both simultaneously work and don't work. And as anyone who's like a student of like logic of any kind, this should be really, really upsetting to us. Right? The fact that John Ossoff can spend $9 million, in a district that the district next door looks exactly the same, and someone spends $35,000 and they get almost the exact same results, should make all of us really queasy. The fact that we know television advertising is the least most expensive way to reach people, and yet it's the only way to reach 90% of the voters that you want to do, that you will never knock on their door. That's like an illogical problem. Like, it should be upsetting. As we industrialize and scale up all of these successes or these advances that we make, there is something being left behind. There is something palpably missing, right? I think field is a good example. We know that field is worth your last 5 points, the 5 points you can't get from anywhere else. There is nowhere else to get them except to go out, find the people, and bring them in. But we have these new models by which we sort of have people tapping people, tapping people, tapping people to do this instead of small coordinated campaigns. And my argument would be that distance diminishes signal. It would be that the farther away you pull in someone, like we're having it in Texas right now, all kinds of people who ain't from Texas, are coming in and running a lot of campaigns. And that's great, and they're empowering volunteers to do really good work, but the actual nature of how they're setting up those structures is just sort of this top-down, industrial, do it, we're all in this together model. It's not based on the conditions on the ground, on the relationships that are idiosyncratic to your area. So, this is the right audience for this, but I would say we need a more bespoke farmer's market version of field organizing than this kind of ultra-industrialized model, because it's not that efficient on the ground. Works great if you're running for president, doesn't work great if you're running in a smaller election. Conditions in the ground are the total situation, right? This is what our movement is uniquely unsuited to do. We react to conditions on the ground, right? Someone's gonna run a great campaign and they're gonna lose because, the district just wasn't gonna happen, but I think it's gonna be great for next time. That's totally a great and a healthy attitude, but it presupposes some idea that there's some kind of level playing field we're all playing on, right? Like the movement, the transparent kind of movement end of it demands as a presupposition that there is this level playing field. All of our demands for campaign finance reform demand that there is this level playing field, and there's not. And so it really drives us into what is a failure, essentially, of a business model. Like political parties, as we know them, are essentially business conglomerates. They're a group of companies, a group of candidates, there's a finite pool of money, there's a finite pool of folks who do it, there's a finite pool of voters, and it becomes this closed, democratic, complex industrial complex. And all of our brave candidates who are in the room have probably had to deal with this in some regard or other. But if you don't use people who are inside a circle of sort of, party trust, you can be punished. You can be shut out from things. You can have donors taken away from you. Because there is this finite resource, the pie has to get cut up a certain way. There's always going to be a winner. There's always going to be a loser. And this is the result, is that we have a model that is only based on turning out likely Democratic voters, right? And that is not a real model for changing the country. And all the technology and all the companies and all the people who do all this work only have a model that works based on likely Democratic voters. And some of those tactics, I would argue, and we'll talk about this as we go through, turn off the non-voters and are making them a permanent non-voting class. And at its very nature, I think, as a movement, we need to listen to more of our friends in the software foundations and some of this sort of things who tell us that inherently having proprietary information makes our products inferior. So if you think about it, let's say we have our fake level playing field. We have all the Democrats in the world giving a certain amount of money to have technologies be created that are only democratic. You have Republicans doing that too. They have more money, so theirs are probably going to be better in the end. But right now, it's relatively evil. Evil. I kind of like that. So it's kind of evil. And then what we have is these ones in the middle who are sometimes open source, open to anyone. They take in all kinds of information. They sell their stuff cheap. And there's a definite divide in our movement right now with people who don't want to use Nation Builder. Have you guys heard of Nation Builder? Yeah. Some people use nation builder, some people don't. I think the Klan uses nation builder. Definitely the American Nazi Party does. But kind of so what? They use it because it's the cheap best one. Like, it's this very sort of strange sense that we have our technologies and no one else should use them, and it sort of ghettoizes them in the very classic sense of what that word means. And we force people to fight a symmetrical war. And when you think about it, it starts to sound really dishonest. We're sending out working people to fight. I'm sorry, I have no idea why that is on or why it's making that noise, but I can't promise it won't happen again. We're sending out working class people to fight people who are more resourced than them and more powerful than them. And I think some of it has to do with our obsession with symmetry. We think that symmetry is beauty. So look at this. You can't read what it is, don't worry. But this is the Mean Girls seating chart from the French Revolution. It goes from left to right. These things have different categories. And the symmetrical truth that we've all decided is correct is that as you go to the edges, you lose people, and there's this big bell curve in the middle where everybody is. And that's absolutely not true based on anything than on some weird aesthetic view we have that things ought to look symmetrical. That is not. The universe is actually very asymmetrical. And as I have always maintained, symmetry is the last refuge of incompetent scoundrels and Wes Anderson. That's an Arun original quote, and I would like you to repeat that. And we all know objects aren't beautiful anyway, right? The only thing that can actually be beautiful is an action. And this is another thing that we get sort of obsessed with in the movement, you know? Like, handsome is worth maybe 10 extra points in the race. I get it because of the way we're at, but ugly is what sells during the revolution, right? And the problem is when we start working backwards from image, look, let me just explain it in terms of rock stars, right? Music was better when we let ugly people make music because there's more ugly people, so there's more of them that are going to be able to make good music, right? Like the idea that some person who's extraordinarily good looking is also going to be really talented is like just Barack Obama. That's it. Beto's very handsome. They're actually very similar builds. So these people who are really, really skinny in real life, you're like, oh, you're too skinny, but then on camera it just looks really, really good. This is a digression. So let's get back to our political system, which you'll see I've represented with a casino here, because we call it the house and we call the people in charge the man, but it's actually a casino. And to carry our analogy of symmetrical warfare, we are sending workers in to gamble with their money against dealers who are using the house money. Those are the Koch brothers, right? And it is not going to work. Money is like water. It gets everywhere, right? It finds its own level and it gets into things. And when we create these two closed-off systems and allow a lot of money to wash into one and doesn't go into the other one, you have to start to wonder whether the ways we're thinking about campaign finance reform are helping or hurting us. Like, have corporations stop donating unholy amounts to people? Not particularly. Are labor unions having more trouble? A little bit. The next thing is not the thing I thought it was going to be. And we're getting a situation that I feel has some moral tension to it. The idea that the most valuable thing a working class person has to offer our movement for change in America is a $5 contribution, a vote, and maybe making a phone call for you seriously undervalues their labor. They are a valuable human person in the world who produces a lot of wealth. And so we need to start thinking about it from that standpoint. And then we need to start wondering whether all these emails that we send begging people for their last $5 are actually truly moral. Is that the right way? If we know that there's less money on our side, and if we know we keep losing, asking people to scrape up more and more of what they don't have doesn't totally seem like the best solution. It's kind of our really sick relationship with buying things, right? Like in the old days, you left the farm, you had to go into town and buy something. It was a pain in the neck. It was a chore. Right? Then it was like the shopping mall and everything was amazing and this is a leisure activity. Maybe I'll get addicted to shopping things. That's going to be fun. I get endorphins. It kind of continues that way. But now, kind of with the resistance and all that, it's this thing where if you don't consume in a certain way, you're hurting the movement, you're hurting the cause, you're being bad somehow, just because of the stuff that you buy, which you may not even have that much control over. We're getting to the point now where you're in trouble if you didn't buy a pair of Nikes last week. It's like last time I remember they were some evil sweatshop company. These people aren't your friends. And as we talked about in 2012, they're not even people. We have a hard time talking about class in the Democratic Party. In your Democratic Party. I'm an independent. In the Democratic Party. Yeah, that was obnoxious. I'm sorry, it just comes out. But we get really squeamish talking about class. We get really squeamish talking about these things because everyone in America is middle class. Nobody's poor, nobody's rich. Maybe they're about to be rich, but like, I get by, I do fine. And it's just not right. It shames poor people, and as Jim Gaffigan so eloquently said, has your mother ever made anything as good as a McDonald's French fry? And the answer is no, not even close. There's nothing wrong with the decisions that poor people make. I'm going to blame the baby boomers solidly for this whole situation, and I know that there's some people in the generation who are here with us tonight, and I don't want that to feel overly aggressive, but it's definitely your fault. The prime motivations of like gentrification, have happened from that class, and it's definitely affected the party, in which our party has essentially been gentrified, right? Like our party is now the party of professionals. You heard the jobs Amanda list off that are acceptable jobs before you run for office, right? They're all I call them the Aaron Spelling jobs, right? That he would make a show out of. It's like you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an architect, you're like one of these things that someone makes a show about, and that's where we're at. And we've also created, in this industrial system of scaling up all of these things, all of these companies and people, and we've made these professions with people who need jobs, not even sure if it's effective for the movement. So now we have a class of sort of young, ambitious people, like, who are working in politics, who don't even know where their next job is coming from, and who need it, and it's sort of, you see it creating a lot of churn, which is why I think we're having so much more unionization in campaign work, which is great. It's gotten everywhere, all right? Gentrification has even ruined our rich people. Totally ruined our rich people. Like, Tom Steyer seems like a nice guy, but like the idea that a progressive billionaire has to make themselves the public face of something that they do is like antithetical to good old-fashioned aristocratic values that we used to rely on for our rich people. You write checks and you STFU, right? Like this is part of the deal. We let you be rich, we don't kill you and eat you, and like, you pay for the symphony, and like it's all good, But that's kind of dripped away, right? It has this sort of new, really cloying value to it. And the consumers are often, sometimes it's just to remind me when I'm talking about, like, you have no reason to be what are the Brothers Grimm on there right now. But the consumers are also almost always wrong. It's not a good place to go to ask for, like, real information. I know the market's a genius or whatever. But actually, take a look at the Brothers Grimm. I should look up what year this was, but I think it's like 1879, they put out the first copy of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, which, as you know, is a book for children to not go into the woods because you will be raped and murdered. That's what happens in the woods. That's what all those stories are about, right? It is to instill fear in people to make them not do a thing. You would think that over the course of decades, probably by the 1950s, I'm sure, they cleaned it up a little bit. And no, the very next year, they actually, because of complaints of parents, they took out all the sex and violence and like re-released it, making it utterly useful. Yes, it's what the consumer, useless, sorry, it's what the consumers wanted, but now this book does not teach your kids to stay out of the woods anymore. Primary sources. This is what we did the Brothers Grimm. Primary sources are cheap. I know a lot of people are struggling in the cash for all of your organizations. Always do research on your primary sources, because that's how you do it. That's why we have the Brothers Grimm. Okay, so what is to be done? I would contend that there needs to be a second ingredient alongside the movement to deal with these irregularities, these tensions, both these moral and practical tensions, and to engage in asymmetrical warfare. That's a little cat who's attacking the elephant, if you can't see. Because they have been waging asymmetrical warfare against us for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. As Aesop said in the year, whatever BC, we hang petty thieves and appoint the great ones to public office. Uh-oh. Did I hit stop or something by accident? No, there we are. That's all good. Conspiracy. See, I know that's getting everybody excited. You think we're going to, put on berets and, plan the operation, and maybe we will. Who knows? The day is young. But no, what a conspiracy actually is, let me back it up. I think people's misunderstanding of what a conspiracy is comes from a kind of misunderstanding of evolution. And a lot of people a lot of us grapple with these scientific concepts and don't quite get them, right? If I was to talk to you about evolution, we would have a smart conversation where, oh yeah, certain genetic traits in animals are better than others, and so they have those, and they end up being this better thing than they used to be. And that's sort of right, but no, the real answer in evolution is that everything that's not structured exactly like you and everything else alive on this planet is dead, because they don't have what it takes to make it. And so when social orders change and when history moves along, and when you're looking for what the anti-establishment is, or looking for what anything is, it's always a series of seemingly unconnected groups, but that are inherently put together because everything else around them has dropped away. And so that's why, here's my conspiracy board. We have angry students, We have workers, we got drug dealers, and we got werewolves. These are all 4 anti-establishment figures. And I'm sorry if that isn't intersectional as all hell, just want to say. Okay, so when we're talking about the movement, we're talking about ubiquitous content, right? We're talking about always being in people's faces and contacting them all the time. And I think we see the symptoms of that online, right? In our virtue signaling and our sort of weird self-care stuff, and in our call-out culture. It's kind of the negative aspect of this kind of ubiquitous communication online. You deliberately can't read this, so don't worry. It says scarcity and secrecy. The conspiracy is going to be based not on ubiquity and transparency, but on scarcity and secrecy. And through that, we will be able to fight asymmetrical warfare. First thing you can do is you can escape from the news cycle. Openness and transparency is great, but like we talked about last time, that first Instagram post you put, before that there was void. Now I'm on Instagram. Now if I'm not constantly feeding Instagram, people are going to wonder where I am. Doesn't he not eat food anymore? Did you not go on any expensive beach vacations? Like, what happened? And so you're constantly forced to respond to things in the world or you're doing something wrong. If you do not have a transparent organization, if you have a small group of people who are just working on something, you do not have to do that. You can actually engage in what we call future thinking. Because look, the actual ball and the pendulum doesn't know where it is, right? And the ball, we're the ball in this metaphor. And we don't know, and we really can't judge where we are. And you see this in politics, right? Whoever wins the midterms, you're like, this is a new permanent Democratic majority. You're like, you just won one election. Everybody needs to settle down. It kind of seems like it switches every 4 years or every 6 years. You can do the math. And you can actually watch those things and part of the reason Trump was probably going to win was that's where the pendulum was, and that's just how it works. And if we always think that we're only in that exact moment, we're almost always going to get it wrong. This is all of the moments. Here's all the moments from 4000 BC to now. And essentially, there's one question that's being asked, right? Like, is a well-considered life worth living, or should we just be drunk all the time, right? That's sort of that's the Socratic thing that we've been working on. And we decided A, but B seems okay. I don't know. Maybe we need to go back. The last 300 or 400 years have been deciding that institutions can make people better. We call it the Enlightenment. People sort of aren't there right now. So when we're trying to decide where we're at, people feel much more embattled and tribal, and not like we're becoming better people, but nature and nurture are locked in an internal struggle, and I think most people in this room would say that nature seems to be winning right now, not nurture. And anyone who's a parent in the room already knows that. That's how it is. Oh, that's depressing. I shouldn't want to talk about that. That's a Kumaru's thing. What all this gets down to is what this fellow thought. Again, primary sources. This is Ibn Khaldun. He is the first sociologist. And he believed, by observing kingdoms in the Bedouin desert, that there were 5 stages of history and it all worked out that way, right? You emerge from the desert, you're really hungry, you do a good job, your kids are pretty smart, and their culture, their kids are kind of dumb, and then the next... a better way to say it is in terms of a television show, right? It's the first season, there's too much exposition, but everyone has good ideas. The second and third, they hit some really good plot points, and they fire the showrunner in the 4th, and by the 5th, the actors are directing it, right? And it's terrible. Where we're at right now, I already told you, we're at the stage of history in which young, ambitious people are told to get bent, and that's always dangerous, but we get stuck in these cycles and we don't recognize them. I got into politics in 2004, officially into politics in 2004, thinking that maybe some better messaging could stop the Iraq War. And the kind of lesson of the Iraq War, to me, is the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And I'm sure it was happening before then, but this is just my experience, right? Which is, not a large minority of people say something's a bad idea. America does that thing anyway. Everyone agrees it was a bad thing and says, who could have ever saw that? No one. And then moves on to the next one, right? And you're like, but 30% of the people thought that was really dumb. Like the Iraq War, lots of smart people thought that was a really, really, really bad idea. It doesn't matter. It just keeps churning out and out over again. And that's a lesson for our movement, because this is a forest trees thing, that's just to remind me. It's because we can fight on every barricade and do well, but we can continue to lose the war unless we engage in asymmetrical warfare. What does that mean, even more so than what we said? It means voting by other means, right? Actually going to the booth is only one way to vote. Here are some others. Cultural vandalism, whisper campaigns, direct job actions, industrial sabotage. Are we all going after here to blow up a factory? I don't know, but we'll see what happens. And this stuff isn't cheap. And that's why when we're thinking about these kind of really effective asymmetrical campaigns, we have to start thinking about where the money is going to come from. We know where we don't want to take it. We know we don't want to take in corporations and people who have an influence on the system. But there are other places that we may be thinking about taking it. Am I saying for sure we need to take drug dealing money? Not for sure, because I wouldn't say that in front of you. I'm just implying it very, very heavily. Asymmetrical warfare is essentially, in this sense, is taking lessons from the past and applying them to the future, and ignoring the present to an extent. The present is where the movement lives, and it's so important, and they're out there doing it and bringing up issues and bringing people places, and I'm not trying to dismiss that. I just think we already know how that works, and that's why we need to work on this stuff more. But this is, remember, the farther back you go, the cheaper the ideas are going to be, and in the future is an abstract plane that is an even battlefield, because it doesn't actually exist yet. We'll talk about that a little more. We need to engage in more choke point organizing. Are you guys familiar with this? Some people are doing some really smart work on this. And the idea basically being, let's take it at its most simple, like a pipeline. Yeah, Standing Rock, and I was there, and I don't know if any of you else were there, it was like super beautiful and spiritual and the whole thing, the whole nine, the sage, it was all good. But there are like many places that are less sort of media sexy to cover, which is again the sort of the movement thing, that actually are choke points where there's like 12 pipelines that come together in some like insane thing, and it's just a very vulnerable spot, and having a protest there would actually like freak the company out to like their very core and like demand a big reaction. And there's people who are thinking about this in really real ways. But the thing I think is the most exciting about it is that it is inherently asymmetrical, and that it will live outside of the kind of normal planning that we do as strategic communicators. The thing that you need to do to be most effective, and being most effective is being most asymmetrical, is follow things upstream to the logical beginning. Like, the Keegan Gudis bank shot is an advertising version of this. Keegan Gudis works at Rev, and we just named it after him because it was his thing. But let's say you need to get out a message, an abortion message, not just to the sort of grassroots people who are activists, but to that next level out, right? That one where there might be people who are sort of receptive, but they're not really that activisty. That's the sweet spot that everyone wants to hit, and it's actually one of the hardest things to hit. The movement idea would be, well, activate your grassroots, give them something to do. Let's get a steady stream of communications going. Let's make sure there's some churn going, and let's start this process. It's expensive. It takes a lot. We might have to knock on some doors. The Keegan Gudis bank shot is walk all the way up to the top of Mount Abortion. And when you get all the way at the top, it's not Planned Parenthood or NARAL. It's like, I don't even know who it is now, right? It's like the Family Forward Focus Foundation for Fetal Rights or something. Like, whoever it is, like whoever's like the absolute we hate you the most abortion people, that's the top of the mountain. So if you start the boulder there, it's going to have more momentum. It gets to the bottom. What do I mean? Advertise on red state. Advertise to those people. Target them specifically with your pro-abortion message. They react very badly to that. For free, it then spreads out into their movement. It then reflects out into your movement with such momentum that without having even had to pay much for it, it gets past your grassroots and into that next level of people. Does that make sense? It does not make sense. Do you want to ask me about it? So, you go to the top of the mountain, you spend a small amount of money advertising your pro-abortion message to anti-abortion activists, essentially just kicking the hornet's nest, and then you can get a lot more organic motion out of that. And the metaphor I'm making is that it's momentum coming down a hill. Yeah. Yeah, that's the live action version. And how exciting was it? It was amazing. Show up when you're not wanted. Don't always show up where you're wanted. They kind of didn't want him that much. They were very polite about it, But it was beautiful, and they were very nice, and it was very respectful. I was there. It was good. Yes. So first, let's say we put it on red state. Like, what will happen is you're advertising it to people, and they'll immediately start reposting their friends, being like, "What is this? Why did I receive this ad?" And so then there is this organic churn of the WTF, like, why do I have this? That wouldn't happen if you sent it to your people. Your people are like, "Oh yeah, abortion's cool. like next thing. So you have a much, much higher reaction of that first ripple. And so then the second ripple, when it's anti-abortion activists in general who are like, we are being targeted by like pro-abortion, and so then it ripples out into the NARALs and Planned Parenthoods without having to have spent that money, or their members are then activated to fight this thing. So then you're bringing people out, but you haven't spent the money. So you spent money, I'm just make up numbers, but to make 10 people mad instead of 1,000 people excited. And it costs the same amount of money by person online, right? So if I can make 10 people mad, I have the same energy as 1,000 people excited in this particular case. I'm not saying making people mad is the only way to make the internet work. It is cost effective though. Once there's enough and those things start trending, then they go on the automatic, they are automatically picked up by all of the people who are looking for that, which are all of the abortion reaper rights groups. Yeah, and organically, and fighting, talking to each other, who knows, yelling. But the yelling will be heard by the people in the apartment next door, which is what you want. That was a metaphor with a boulder, and we ended up in the apartment next door, and I apologize. That was mixed. That was all over the place. Yeah. Will it change minds? Not of any of the people until the people at the end, with the people you wanted to hit. So yeah, you worked up a lot of emotions of a lot of people, not to change anything, but you wanted to talk to people in the apartment next door for cheap. And as you all know from organizing, that's the hardest thing to do, is to bring a new person into the fold. To bring in a new vote that was not a vote is something that is much more expensive than it is to, activate a previous vote. And when we talk about sabotage, we're not talking about things that are going to get everyone arrested. We had a big joke about, the thing before, but I wasn't totally serious about that. We're talking about what Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and IWW folks were always saying, right? And in fact, one of the best ways to commit sabotage is to use rules and the law, right? One of the most effective ways to shut a factory down is to obey every byline that's been written by every single person. And you're like, hey, it says I need to get 6 signatures before I do this thing, so you're number 5. And just if you obey all the rules at a place, everything shuts down. This is just one example. But there are so many ways to engage in this kind of vandalistic acts that aren't overtly criminal. Okay, so let's actually take what we're learning and apply it to something specific. So, November 7th. It's rapidly approaching. I think it's in 38 days. No, this is the day after. Yeah. November 6th is my birthday, though, and thank you for remembering. I appreciate you. People are going to ask themselves the question of the day, which is, what motivated Democrats to come out, and what made Republicans stay home? This is assuming that we take the House, which we probably will, but by not as much as we should. Question of the decade. What is the new permanent majority on the oh my God, it's a rising class of, oh my God, have you seen Hispanic people exist all of a sudden? Everything's going to be great. This has always been, this is not what it is. The question of the century is, why do fewer people vote than voted in 1911 in America? Why do the numbers keep going down and keep going down? That's the real question, right? And that's the sort of question that none of our business models are pushing us to ask. So me and some other nice folks, are actually engaged in a non-voter project, and I would love to get you more information on that when we have more. But I did want to talk a little bit about the methodology, because I think you guys don't think that I'm being serious about this primary sources stuff. But have you guys any of you ever been in a focus group, either as someone conducting one or being in one? They are the worst. Right? It's like a room full of, I used to work in advertising too. It's like a room, you send somebody into a room and you're like, I want you to try McDonald's new bold coffee. What do you think? And they're like, well, it seems a little bold. And you're like, bold. I'm going to put you down for bold. And that's basically the whole thing. And then you give them $20 and they go. So right after we kill all the television consultants, we are going to murder all the pollsters. But we're not going to rely just on ourselves, although I do that a lot. We're going to use the Torah for methodology. I said primary sources. I said primary. This one's very primary. The Torah tells us that we can ascertain the truth from a person by 3 things. What they say when they are angry, what they say when they are drunk, and by what they spend money on. I think Moses was yelling at the priest class somewhere in Exodus. So that's what we're going to do. We've been interviewing people at the DMV. We've been interviewing people in bars. We've been going to where they are and having those conversations instead of inviting them into other places. There'll be much more on this soon, but the one feedback I wanted to tell you so far, and you're not going to like it. You're not going to like it. Okay, some people hopefully will love it. I know you carry them around and they seem heavy and they stab you and yard signs don't vote, and I've heard all of these things. Yard signs are literally the only form of political communication that non-voters are getting in. This is like 100% for every single conversation that I've had. I know it's antithetical to everything that we've been taught, but it is true. And it makes us wonder what we put on our yard signs, right? Because like I had a conversation with a nice young man outside Lake Travis, Austin, and I was like, he was telling me about yard signs. He's like, oh yeah, I see stuff on Facebook sometimes, but mostly, I see the yard signs. And he's like, yeah, because my congressman's from here. I was like, number one, yes, your congressman should be from there because that's your congressman, but it's okay. And he was like, yeah, but it will work. And it's like, dude, that is not your congressman even slightly, right? That he is 7 districts towards El Paso. Like, that is not a place where it's at. But like, so this is the level of communication we're having. Incorrect name ID, right? Like that's not good. Just a sign that said Medicare for all shoved in the ground would have been better, right? Actually broadcasting a message to non-voters. So I think maybe putting more messaging in our yard signs is something that will be a result, but we're not there yet. This is the beginning of the non-voter project. So I just want to leave with some solutions for what we all are going to be, which is the new anti-establishment. And I think the first one we already talked about, right? Which is to devolve, right? To stop scaling up, to stop pretending we're Silicon Valley, to stop sort of just trying to like mass produce. Every time we win something, we can't just decide that that's the way it has to be for the rest of time. It's like, oh, texting's the best. Now everyone only text. It's like everyone just runs from one thing to the next. And we need to remember that we're in our revolutionary adolescence. And we have to have more self-awareness. And as Golda Meir said, don't be so humble, you're not that great, right? So let's like be proud, but also like really keep track of where we're at. There's a Yiddish expression that it feels good to stop hitting your head with a hammer. And I think that is where we're at with like our victories. For every person who we sneak over the line, AOC is a great example. Literally snuck through a door no one was looking at, right? Guess what? That door is going to be locked next time. It's going to be locked solid. So we need to not think like we're mastatizing cells, but like that we are actually a virus. We need to remember we are the virus and they are the host. And we need to change our tactics every single time because they will make new antibodies to us every single time. And if you don't think like a Bernie Sanders run in 2020 is going to be rough because of that, you have not been paying attention for the last 250 years. As the great American philosopher and convicted rapist Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's why we need principles and not plans. We need to actually just have a few principles by which we go on and not start telling people what the scheme is, but this is how we operate. And when you can convince people of your principles, they're actually along for the mission. They're along for the ride, and they will even be more forgiving of you as a legislator. If you can actually have that relationship where you're like, I am guided by this compass, but I am plan agnostic. You want to call it Medicare for all? Call it something else. Call it Trump care. I do not care. Let's not call it Trump care. And look, all of us, we're having so many problems right now. Everyone hates everyone so much, right? Like, we also have to remember that all of us are in this together and that everyone is not going to agree on everything. It used to be called a popular front, right? The idea was everybody gets together and fights fascism. And that worked until the anarcho-syndicalists and the anarchists and the communists had like major problems over things and like killed each other instead. So let's not be like that. Because they are already committing sabotage and asymmetrical warfare against us, like I said. And this is the main one where it happens, right? Demanding to have details on things. Saying something seems really, that sounds great, but it seems super complicated. This is how they win over and over again, and we play into it when we fight with each other about this stuff. Remember how Bernie Sanders had to have the exact address of the first bank he was going to break up, but like you can go invade a country and like not know how you're going to leave? It's like it's because the powerful are the only ones who are always asking for the details, and details will always favor the strong. They're always going to favor the strong. We need to make universal tools for universal people, right? What I mean by that is the devil is in the details. The instant something is not universal, all of a sudden it's denied to poor people, black people, like, name your marginalized community, gay people. Like, it doesn't matter what a thing that you're being given is. The instant it's not being given to everyone, they're going to take it away from somebody. It's so funny, right? I remember in the 2016 campaign, right? Everyone was sort of mad. They're like, free college education. You really think we should send Trump's kids to college for free? It's kind of like, Well, number one, yes, right? And I like to be able to pick where they go because, like, obviously it's not working. But no, that doesn't, like, bother me at all because the instant you make some way that, like, rich people can't do the thing, they're going to make sure that nobody else can do the thing, and it's going to totally be messed up. This is a great example of it, right? Universal basic income. I just say it, and immediately half of you are like, yeah, that makes sense. People shouldn't starve just because they're alive. And the other half of you are like, it sounds like a way to make a permanent short group of people who don't get enough nutrition to like live as slaves in Silicon Valley. And you're probably both right. But again, it's the detail that makes this terrible. Look what I did. I fixed it. Universal income. I got rid of the detail. Now we're all in agreement. See how easy that was? We're all there. As we lose faith in our institutions, we replace it with something else, right? Either with a kind of new age spirituality where people buy, you know, the self-care like aromatherapy online, or this sort of overly ambitious belief in tech. Or rituals, and the rituals in our lives are no longer spiritual, right? They're sort of sad. This is a direct picture of my life, sorry. But what I am trying to do, and so I'm gonna leave you this thought, is one of the things we can do that's asymmetrical is actually embrace a very, very specific spirituality. And I say this as a historical dialectical materialist. This has been hard for me to admit, and I've come across only since like 2016. And Richard Spencer, after Trump won, made a speech to a group of, I'm sure they were neo-Nazis, fine people, I'm sure. And he said, y'all, he doesn't say y'all. He said, you all made this happen through the sheer force of your will by wanting it badly enough. And like you listened to, you're like, that's not wrong. That's not wrong at all. Holy shit. We need to make sure that we are doing that too. Absolutely. We need to act, like any medical patient, that actually like the hope is part of the thing. We do need to actually get that back in there. That's my Darren. She's my favorite witch. And so when we're looking around at who our new allies are, the people who I've decided to let into my life are actually spiritualists and magicians. And anyone who is using spirituality in an unorganized way, because they're really anti-establishment. It didn't even occur to me till really recently. Like, magic religion is like organized crappy magic, right? And the real stuff is obviously not part of that. And I think it's really important that we harness it for the movement. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you. But really, that was a lot, and it would be nice if you guys have questions, or if we need to move right on to the panel, you let me know. Okay. Yes.
I think the thing that yelled out at me the most, because that's what I've been trying to say to a lot of people, is we know what our principles are. We have to be true to those principles all the time, not some of the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And be able to justify the work, show the work on it. Like, to be able to be like, no, these are our 3 principles, and this is how I thought about it as I was developing this thing. I think it's so important, right? And the plans, when you have a plan and it has a mistake in it, it's sort of unforgivable. But when you have principles, making a mistake in your plan, it's forgivable because we can see the work. Yeah.
So, I just want to get clarity on something as well, because I feel like in terms of the form of organizing, there's really no form of organizing that we have to subscribe to at any point in time. It should be based on what's on the ground.
Based on what's on what?
Based on what's present in the current situation of the place they are in. It's not distributed organizing is the key. It's not this is the key. It's not this thing. It's like very arbitrary is what you're saying.
No, I'm saying when you're having those conversations, sending people out to canvass on Kavanaugh right now, right, wouldn't be an effective use of canvassing time because you're having the conversation that's already happening right away. I'm saying to actually create those pathways, that creating pathways of communication in the community. That was so many C's that it sounds like I'm just making this up, but no, I think making those connections on the very local level in a coordinated way that makes sense with institutions on the ground creates a permanent kind of organizational structure, while the kind of I don't want to call out any campaigns because there's so many awesome people trying so hard and not everyone was as successful, but Abdul in Michigan, right? Do you remember all these things where it's we texted 400,000 people today and knocked on 8 million doors, and it was it felt very military, right? It was these are the numbers, we're posting big numbers, and the quality of these communications and these contacts isn't good. And I think what you're saying about this about organizing today for the issues of tomorrow, or about what's happened, right? It is what's important to be able to take the things that have happened in the community and explain how you can connect that to the future, but not to be having I'm not here to talk to you about an election, right? If I'm in front of your door, I should not be there to talk to you about an election. I guess that's probably a shorter way of saying it. You're skeptical. Go ahead, ask.
I'm just I'm thinking of a way for it wherein I'm trying to put it in a box, but it feels like it shouldn't be in a box type of what I feel like you're saying is there's no rigid framework of which an organizing strategy should be put in a certain.
Yes, and we should empower local organizers, folks who've worked in the community. A lot of times, they're labor organizers in a community who are the kind of new kids who are coming up digitally don't know to have a conversation with to actually talk about what the hills and valleys of the specific landscape look like. And so we just take should Beto win, and it's going to be very close. There's going to be a lot of disappointed people if he doesn't, but it's not a sure thing. Everyone's going to do whatever he did, everyone in the country. And you're like, well, that's not necessarily going to work, right? Remember when everyone was Barack Obama in 2008, and people would be like, hey, how can you make me into Barack Obama? And you'd be like, I don't want to have this conversation because you're just not Barack Obama. It's some of that, right? There is no one way, and by sort of industrializing the model and making out-of-the-box solutions, we're never going to get there. Yeah.
I was going to give a personal example of how I campaign a lot differently than most people. Every interaction I have is an opportunity for me to learn a lot, and I always make it about them. So if I'm at a restaurant, I'll ask, what's your name? How long have you worked here? Do you have any other jobs? I'll find out as much information about them before they learn I'm even a candidate.
Totally.
Which, it's just a whole different way to do things.
I like that you're a candidate is the conclusion of your conversation, right? It becomes this thing where it's whoa, that's crazy. Well, what are we going to do about it? Well, you can vote for me. Whoa!
And you can tell 3 people that you know to come to the polls. And it's really an empowerment model. It shows that I'm trying to learn about the issues that affect them the most. I'll find out if they have kids, if they can afford where they live, any number of things about what's happening in their life and how is it relevant to what we're trying to do. So, cashiers at Walmart, you name it. How long have you worked here? Those kinds of questions are really.
She's such a good candidate. Right? Yeah.
I'm glad you spoke, Amanda, because I think that you're saying that there shouldn't be an industrialized marketing strategy, but in a way you're creating an industrialized marketing strategy. When you have a great candidate like Amanda, Bernie Sanders, Paul Wellstone, Ocasio-Cortez, they understand their community, they try to understand their community better, they have their idiosyncratic, specific way of doing things, and I'm not sure, I don't want to negate your entire presentation, but I'm not sure that
that's not my impression of Bernie Sanders. I know him pretty well.
Well, but who would say that you should get up in front of 17,000 people and give it an hour and a half long specific policy speech, which is his thing, right?
Yeah. But he's not asking questions, so his model's not the same as Amanda's.
Right. No, but that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know that I think that a great campaign emerges out of the passion of a great candidate, and I'm not sure that anybody can give them that.
But it's also people who believe in the message. So it's my candidacy would be meaningless if people didn't really.
Sure.
There's practical applications to what you're saying, though, and it's so important, right? And this is one of the big Bernie lessons, right? Is there's a magical time in conventional wisdom where you shift from message persuasion to GOTV, right? And you're just did you make a plan? Do you have a ride? Can I help you get there? And all that stuff is important. But what the Bernie Sanders campaign did, up until the very last bit of election day, we never shifted over to GOTV. We kept going with message. And that is unusual. And I do think that might be a universal truth in there somewhere, not to just crazy industrialize it. But again, it's there's always the message on the yard sign. There was always just something, there was always an issue where if you were not just a political cheerleader, there was something for you in there. And I think that maybe is a universally important thing. Just that, the voter never just wants to hear, especially if they're not a regular likely voter, did you make a plan? It's going to be so much fun when you vote. You get the sticker. It's going to be great. You're I don't, it's this weird school spirit stuff, right? That those of us who, want to sit behind the bleachers and smoke cigarettes, are just never going to be into. Yeah.
So we understand that the establishment is not really interested in expanding their electorate. So they're kind of Huh?
It doesn't seem like it, yeah.
It doesn't seem like it, right? And yet we have examples like Alexandra Ocasio, that she kind of, started to work early and started to door knock and expanding that electorate, and we're seeing that same formula work somewhere else. How do you feel about that in regards to what we're talking about?
I feel great about expanding the electorate, really great. Actually, if we're going to have, and some of you were down there, so like in New York, so correct me where I'm wrong, but I do have numbers on this. I don't think she much expanded the electorate. Actually, the person who expanded the electorate the most in New York was Suraj Patel, who lost by a lot, but he actually was the one who brought in more new voters and actually more young voters, which is interesting. It's Brooklyn demographics also, let's be clear. But that was interesting, right? So expanding electorate is hard. There are not many people doing it. I think you saw the desire for people to do it for Bernie, which is why it's so great to have inspiring candidates people want to do it for. But like New York is a good example of like the immovable object of that people are excited and yet they are not actually allowed to vote. And so those disconnects, those tensions are still there, for sure. But yeah, no, I think expanding the electorate and doing it with passion, and like, that's the movement. That's the part that I'm saying we get and we're doing well, most of us. It just needs to have some extra help to set those conditions. Yeah, I would love for Alexandra to be able to win an election, not even in a weird year when no one showed up, right? You want her to actually have a permanent socialist working majority in her district. And I think we're going to do it. Yeah.
When you said expand the electorate, are you talking about like before the election registering new voters? Or are you talking about people who've been registered but haven't voted in years?
So important.
Because it depends on what state you're in. Some states, if you don't vote, so many times, you are not eligible to vote at all. I think in New York, you become inactive, but you can, if whenever you go back to vote, you have to maybe do an affidavit ballot or something like that, but you become active.
Whatever it is, it's harder in New York. We all know that. It's crazy. But yes, and both those things. And I'm trying to get ahead of myself. I'm trying to honestly ask these questions of people. And we're just, I've only done a few dozen of these interviews with non-voters. More than I thought. They are people who have at least been registered at some point. A lot of them keep up their registration and still don't vote. I know that's because whatever I'm doing is going to be self-selecting to some deal where I'm going to be talking to people who are slightly better educated. I admit that those biases exist in my thing. So I am trying to work out more techniques to talk to people who've never been registered and have those conversations. Because the conversations I've had are with the people who sort of lapse. And for them, it's universal, right? Why didn't you vote? Because it doesn't matter. Because it's all bullshit. And what was so interesting was talking to people who were like under 40 years old. I'm 42. People who were under 40 their big negative reaction was Bush v. Gore. That was actually their thing. They're like, everyone knows voting is stupid about Bush v. Gore. And they're like, whoa, that was a long time ago. And they're like, yeah, what's the point? And it's sort of hard to argue. So we need to have some better arguments on our side. Because I find myself just nodding along with them like, yeah, totally is bullshit. You're like, oh, wait a minute. That's not the point of this, though. We really want you to vote.
I believe I heard you say you're an independent.
Yeah, I was just
Yes.
gonna say the same thing.
And we're talking about expanding the electorate, and a lot of, for the most part, this room is filled with Democrats who are pretty pissed at the Democratic Party, but we remain Democrats because of primaries. So there's kind of like a difficult tension in what we're talking about here. If we're going to expand the electorate and register voters, we're going to want to register them as Democrats so that they can vote in the primaries, but we have to provide the right candidate.
It's conditions on the ground. So we need to preset those conditions on the ground and maybe actually making the Democratic Party let independents in the primary here should be the number one focus. I'm not here to say that's right, but if we're talking about what can you do that is the least effort for the most effectiveness, obviously they're not excited about it. It's not no effort, right? You have to shoehorn that one out of them. But I agree, and you have to send people like me. I'm a person like me, right? I should want to be a Democrat to help out, right? But there is something deep inside me that even when I lived in Washington, D.C. and was working for Bernie Sanders, even when I lived in New York and was working for Barack Obama, did not make me change my registration to do that. And I will tell you, both those gentlemen were not impressed with me for that. They were both individually that's lame. And I was like, I can't do it. Yeah, we exist, but so I think there's a structural way to have us come in. But I think the real exciting thing will be bringing in someone who's not a hardened anti-whatever, but someone who's like, nah, I just never voted, I don't know. Because there's plenty of them, right? Like, 60% of the population doesn't vote. There's all kinds of reasons people don't do it, but it is insane. And the idea that we can make any kind of permanent theory about what motivates people to vote while a majority of people don't vote is, I don't know, like, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of science in that, right? You had a question.
Maybe it's more of a comment. Election law is so different in different states. The implication of being an independent in some states is you can then pick the party in which
Texas.
That's Texas. So you see, being an independent in Texas is totally different
Empowering.
from being an independent in New York.
Or DC, both places very bad.
Where it means you can't vote in a primary for a year into the future.
So I think Democrats sticking up for the rights of independence very actively places will impress a lot of people who get turned off by the donkey hats and you know what I mean, all of that stuff. This is the school spirit stuff. To actually be like, yeah, we know you're not into us, but we're actually fighting for you, which we are, right? But let's explicitly make that case. Democrats fight for independence, and we welcome you to fight with us.
And
But
just
how
to
do we
kind
do
of
that?
support what she's saying a little, and what you mentioned
getting
or
to change
featured
the
before with the Democratic Consultant Industrial Complex, I think it kind of falls into that because the party is kind of a business, in my view, and I think you actually articulated that as well. And so they're trying to protect their own interests.
Yeah.
And it's so hard, it will be so hard to pass laws that would change that. And that's the challenge I feel up ahead.
Yes. Yes, yes, and yes. 100%. Right, and politics is a game of scarcity, right? So if we could work on everything, we would. We had fabulous people elected. We would also, fix the state constitution, all these things that we would do. But you can only so much resources to go around. And so that's why triaging who gets what is important. And you don't want to be being made on business decisions just because, someone's like, yeah, we send these kind of crappy emails out and we get a pretty good return. And you're like, what you're doing is making everyone who's not into it a permanent non-voter, right? It's just it just hardens the cement so much. Yeah.
Do you propose that we all change our registration to be independents? So then the governor and the state legislator is forced to then pass laws to open up the primary?
I mean, I'm kind of into it. I want to subscribe to your newsletter. I think it's really hard, right? And to convince everyone to come along, and there is so much people who've been given power. I think it's probably more likely, I don't know, you tell me. Do you think it's in New York State, right? It's hard. This is ground zero for some of this good government stuff, right? Is it more likely to be able to reform the Democratic Party by having radical inclusion of new folks independents and stuff, or, making a separate power block? I don't know. I don't know. But we need to know what our principles are, and then we'll come up with a plan. But I think your plan would be in anyone's top 3 plans, for sure. Yeah.
So I have a question. So the DSA, I think, has put a priority on this Medicare for All and doing an at-large canvassing, door knocking on introducing people to Medicare for All, so that elections come and go, but people kind of get excited about this thing.
It's going really well in Houston.
Yeah. So you think that is so it's a canvassing, but not electorally focused.
Issue canvassing, yeah, totally. And to even take it up a notch, and we're not doing this with the Houston DSA, but actually having people have, accoutrements and buttons and yard signs and actually run the ideas like they're people and get people as excited about it, I think would be super cool. Why not make a mascot, right? Everyone loves Gritty. Where's Gritty for healthcare?
Then I have another question. You mentioned that I think you were a dialectical materialist, and I'd like to know how that influences where you think we're going, because if you're a Marxist dialectical materialist, then the result was supposedly communism. But so that's just a question in general. How does it inform what you do? And then second of all, you mentioned some infighting between communists and that and this, and how do we make sure that... What's that?
In the 30s, yeah.
Right. So how do we make sure that that there's enough cohesiveness in messaging that we have principles and we don't have a plan, but let's say we win the day, how do we actually get along? Yeah, exactly.
I think we have to have new expectations, right? right? Like the basket of deplorables comment, which I think we all thought was probably not a great move, right? Like it put the Obama coalition and totally split it apart because the Obama coalition actually had people who were a little racist in it, right? Like not 1960s civil rights racist, but 1980s comedy racist. You know what I mean? It's like, you might be a little racist. Like that wasn't awesome what you just said, but it's not like this huge thing. And Obama really knew how to talk to those people and they're like part of his coalition. It's like, we actually have to be able to have conversations with people who are maybe slightly a little racist because real racist people like need to go away, but it doesn't mean that we immediately adopt that as our values at all. And so I think being able to actually put together coalitions where people know that we're all fighting against the same thing, but maybe disagree in fundamental ways, is something that is worth spending energy and resources on. Right now, we're all hoping it happens naturally, but like actually putting together an organization that's based on a popular front principle, right? Where different organizations get different votes based on something and maybe decide. You know, this happened a lot more in the 60s and civil rights stuff, where there were people who were like not really on the same side. People had very, very different ideas about how the economy should work, about what imperialism meant in America, but they knew they wanted to dismantle white supremacy to the extent that they could. We have an unreasonable expectation, and some of this is online, of purity. Everything's supposed to be great. I shouldn't even be tired because I can, like, you know, do whatever makes me feel good at the end of the week. Like, we just have this really weird, in-your-face idea of what activism is now, and it doesn't allow for discomfort, any moral discomfort or any physical discomfort seeming of any kind. And I'm just not sure that that's the right way in. But what was your first question? If I could answer number 2 and not number 1. Oh. It makes me, I think, much more view things as institutions changing around, and it's probably why I became a mass media person and not someone who like enjoys knocking on doors, and I do it for the candidates who I love, but it fills me with anxiety, dread, and like horror, and I also like, and as some of us, right? It's like, it's not always the most fun thing, but the idea that the kind of free will of individual voters is this majorly important thing, to me, is not necessarily the case. And if you can set these preconditions on the ground, not that people are mindless automatons, but that things start to shake out in the way that you think they would, and I think that's informed kind of like by my materialism. And I think that the kind of fracturing of the conversation where we're actually expanding into actually talking about socialism is part of the original dialectic that you were talking about. And no, it's not that simple, and we all know that that was mostly Engels with like the, you know, things wither away and things come in. No, but the idea of inexorable progress and how things set the seeds of their destruction, I think, is something that we are seeing. It's just not always clear how those things work, and it's not always clear that we survive it, right? So the idea that like we would wait for capitalism to totally collapse, it's like, we're going to blow the earth up way before then, right? Like something is going to go wrong with some app, they're going to cut the trees down, like just something's going to happen, and they're going to boil the ocean away. Like it'll just happen, and it'll happen because of tech, and it'll happen very fast. And so I think it does make sense just for survival of the species to try to nip that in the bud. I think we're all in broad agreement about that. It's a good room for that, right? Yeah. Yeah, oh my God, you asked me before and I forgot you were there.
Okay, no, okay. Coming back to your idea of the going up to the top of the mountain and like shouting that thing that we've all been like trying to like not bring to the front because it's just going to make chaos. If we want to make chaos because that is part of a bigger plan.
It's right. It's not chaos when it reaches those other people, right? It's like it's chaos. It's a bit of chaos amongst like the people who are farther up the hill, and it's like, what's happening? And this is weird, and we're yelling about this, but it's actually just like so much noise that someone's just like, what's going on? And you're like, oh, those people think that women should have the right to their body. Like, well, you know, that's actually what I think too. Like, that person hears it in a much more coherent way, and just kind of like, oh, what is going on? But they're interested and they're asking what's going on, so they're like into the conversation, and that's the people you want. And yeah, the chaos is probably not that great, like, you know, in terms of how that's working, but those people are already activated back and forth anyway, so they're not changing their
So
minds.
if we applied that instead of doing the abortion rights thing, like with Amanda's campaign, Amanda's here, yeah.
I'm back here.
Like socialism, would that be the thing that we would like go out into the red district and say, hey, you know, we're not hiding in this, we believe in socialism.
I think selling socialism everywhere is something that we're not doing and we need to do. And I do, you know, I'm in my local Houston DSA and we have those discussions and I've said openly, like we've cut back some of our like programs where we work in poor communities to do more electoral work, and that's really important. And there's this a prosecutor who we really want to get like on the Houston bench. But actually like going in and fixing brake lights and just generally being helpful was what was selling socialism to ordinary folks. And I do think that that's important. I don't know that you do it by necessarily trying to like anger people who hate socialism. In this case, I think it's about showing up and being useful and being indispensable, and then no one dispenses with you. And then when you have that base as a community, then I might actually make a really provocative socialist, you know, meme like the kids do with the unicorns and Marx and Stalin or whatever they do, you know, they're nuts. And then when you have your people in your community who you've helped with the brake light, and you have people being like, socialism in Houston, this is ridiculous, and you actually do have like a socialist mayor, there's actually these people coming in the woodwork being like, no, socialism is the suit that I got when I left prison that someone handed to me. Socialism is like the meal that my kid got before he went to school this morning. Like, I actually know what this is. But you've already preceded by having that conversation what it is, so that you can have your people activate rather than wait to educate them as it's happening, you know? Someone's running to be the socialist mayor of Houston, so like now let's learn about socialism. It's like no, that's too late. You know, you haven't preceded the work. Preceded, not preceded. Preceded. I didn't need to correct myself there, did I?
What about food pantries? Great suggestion.
Yeah.
Can we show the second video for Amanda?
Sure.
Because I think that would be nice.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, like between things, like when a run's done, is a run done with questions?
Does anyone have any more questions? Not to throw it away, but. And I'm around, so we can absolutely sit down and have a chat about whatever you'd like.
Thank you so much for joining us again, Arun.
Is that one more question?
Do we have a question? I'm sorry.
I was going to ask it first. I'm a write-in candidate for U.S. Senate as a Democrat, and I just see things through a little bit of a different lens, a little bit independently. And one thing, I know you work with Bernie really closely. I have a web page, a Facebook page called Upstate New York for Bernie Sanders, and I was a big supporter and tried to help as much as I could. But as far as the messaging, you were talking about socialism, and I see something that some people don't talk about, and it seems distasteful because it's either my way or the highway or all or none kind of things. If he had almost like practical socialism in this, tell me what you think about this, but if he had campaigned and said in his speeches and said, instead of free four-year college, if he said, let's start with free community college, and let's try to fund that and then build on it from there, it's still socialistic, to me. But
no, that's right.
And people would have bought into it.
Let's be absolutely totally clear. Bernie Sanders dressed up some not that radical ideas a little more radical than they had to be, to an extent, right? You're like, this is just FDR stuff. You don't have to pretend that we're being Mao here. Let's all just take a step back. This is just democratic stuff. And so I do think there was an element of that. But I have to say, as someone who's sort of watching the plateaus of our numbers and stuff, the sort of story of the growth of the political revolution was these series of holy shit moments where Bernie said something that people couldn't believe that they've been waiting for someone to say. I think
just like Amanda went around to people, and I've talked to people, and it's anecdotal. I've talked to cashiers at Tops and stuff like that who started junior college and backed out because they couldn't afford to keep going. It would have tangibly helped those people. And I think it would have resonated with independents and even some Republicans. And more Democrats that were more street Democrats, which I would call...
Maybe, this is my only caveat on it, and we don't have any answers, right? We're just having a good discussion about it. But I think that the Sanders momentum was buoyed by these moments where people were like, oh shit, you think that? Palestinians are people? Whoa, people were like, this is kind of intense. What you're saying sounds right, except that we always know that actually explaining, when you're explaining, you're losing. And to me, it sounds like an awful lot of explaining, right? Instead of sort of getting out in front and being like, no, this isn't weird. We're going to slowly, incrementally figure these things out, and it's going to be very practical. It's I actually think hitting hard with a message that sounds even a little interesting, whoa, $30 an hour, and you're like, whoa. And then you back up to why it's practical, it's better than sort of building the case and putting it on top, is to kind of and then build the case. And that's not exactly what you're saying, and maybe it doesn't work on a one-on-one conversation with someone. talking more mass media, I think.
It's been, let's offer what you're saying, four-year free college, those kind of things, and then nothing gets done. Whereas if you start building blocks of socialism, you may be able to get something that really tangibly helps hundreds of thousands of millions of people.
I agree, but at the risk of being slightly unkind, I think that's the premise that Hillary Clinton was betting on. And she didn't win the election, do you know what I mean? Like, you know, specifically, it was like, yeah, college free for some people, we'll figure it out later. You know, we'll get to maybe universal stuff eventually. I don't know that it activates enough. I think what you're saying activates likely Democratic voters, but maybe doesn't get out of that. And maybe that's not fair because it's just like people have been so kind of let down that they actually need to kind of be perked back into it. But I do think that you need a little bit of the electricity to get the patient to come alive. But these are the questions we have to be asking, and finding that line is, again, alchemy, not science. Like, figuring that stuff out is really crucial. Cool. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. It's really fun.